Chess friends, you might have to sacrifice your full piece in the middle game or rarely in the opening, so today, I am going to teach you how you can actually sacrifice your knight and shock your opponent in just 5 moves, which Magnus also loves to play in his practice games. I want to share a common opening you'll often see in chess, known as the 4 knights variation, but instead of going through the usual moves, I'll introduce you to a fun and tricky strategy called the Halloween Gambit. Now, at first glance, this position may seem ordinary and symmetrical, but chess is all about surprises, so, let's shake things up by making a bold move. Knight takes on e5, unleashing our Halloween Gambit. Now, I understand your concern about sacrificing your knight, but trust me, this move can work wonders, especially in faster-paced games. The data actually backs this up. White tends to win more often after playing knight takes on e5 compared to other common moves like bishop c4 or d3. And let me tell you a quote in sudden. The more clear you are in the vision of what you want in life, the brighter the spotlight will be to lead you on the right path. So, what happens after black captures your knight? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we can gain momentum by attacking the knights with d4. Now, black has 2 main choices, either knight to c6 or knight to g6. By the way, moving the knight to g4 doesn't make sense because white can attack with e5, hitting 2 pieces at once, causing black to lose a knight. So, in this situation, black wants to keep their advantage in material, and that's why they'll probably move the knight back to one of these 2 squares. Let's first consider knight c6. We begin with d5. Attacking the knight. Now, black has a few choices to move the knight. Knight e7 isn't a good move because it leads to white constantly pressuring the knight with more pawn moves. Eventually, black has to give up either the bishop or the knight after a queen check, so, knight e7 isn't a good option for black. Therefore, black is left with these 2 choices. Let's focus on the most common move, which is moving the knight to e5. This time, we'll use the f-pawn to attack. When black moves the knight to g6, we threaten the other knight. This strategy cleverly forces black to move backward, giving us more space in the center. Remember, the Halloween Gambit relies heavily on pawn moves. Unfortunately for black, they'll end up with an underdeveloped knight. Even if they try to pin our pieces with their queen, we can respond in kind, and eventually, they'll have to retreat the knight. So, after playing e5, most players would choose to retreat their knight immediately. Now that you've made significant progress, it's time to put more pressure on your opponent by advancing further. Look at this pawn, it's putting black in a tight spot and limiting their options. If black tries a normal move like knight to f6, we can check and win material, so black needs to be cautious about this check, which is why they might try to create space for their king. The 2 most common responses you'll encounter are queen to b6 and queen to f6. If black plays queen to b6, we can bring our knight closer, aiming for the c7 fork and reinforcing our defense of the pawn. Keep in mind that this knight to b5 move will be a recurring theme in many variations, so it's an important tactic to remember. Alright, now black's priority is to avoid the fork, so king to d8 is the logical move. We continue our aggressive pawn push. It's worth noting that if black moves to h4, their knight is trapped. The more common response is knight to e5. Keep up the pressure and develop with tempo. Not giving black a chance to counterattack, they might try to defend with f6. In response, you can move your queen, maintain control over the pawn, and aim to castle. If black attempts something like a6 to dislodge the knight and capture the pawn, you have the bishop ready to target the queen. After the queen moves, black faces trouble due to queen a5 check, followed by knight c7 check, winning the rook. Despite losing the pawn, playing as white remains advantageous. You can bring out the knight, castle on the queen side, and black continues to grapple with a vulnerable king and passive pieces on the back rank. Alright, let's revisit how to handle queen b6. If black opts for queen f6, exerting pressure on both pawns, a direct move like knight b5 can be risky due to potential threats like knight f4. This move can cause trouble despite winning the rook, as it exposes your king to black's queen and knight coordination. To avoid this, when facing queen f6, it's better to start with a check. Once black blocks the check, you can proceed with your knight b5 plan. Even if black exchanges queens, the double attack remains, forcing black to move the king. Now, you can aim at this pawn with bishop e3. If black plays b6, you can castle on the king side, control this file with your rook, continue advancing your pawns. and maintain the strong pawn that restricts black's position. Alternatively, instead of moving this pawn, your opponent might choose a6. This move aims to push back your knight to capture this pawn. However, you can counter effectively with successive checks to disrupt black's plans. Eventually, you capture the rook and continue to advance, capturing these pawns as you go, which puts you in a winning position. It's really satisfying to dominate the game like this. Also, it would mean a lot if you could hit the like button below this video right now. Now, let's revisit the scenario. After d5. We've explored the options when black plays knight e5, but what happens if black retreats to b8? Our strategy stays consistent. Simply target the knight, push it back, advance your position, trade pawns, and use your pawn to restrict black's movements. If black tries to create space for the king, remember that knight b5 is crucial. If black plays knight a6, that's not a good spot for the knight. Develop your bishop, then the other bishop, and you'll start putting a lot of pressure on black. Black will be stuck, unable to move these pieces effectively. Meanwhile, you can castle and launch a full-scale attack with all your pieces. I give white almost 5 points of advantage for this position. And let me tell you a quote. If you have 30 minutes for Facebook, you have 1 hour for the gym. But what would happen if you play as black? When you're playing as black and your opponent plays the Halloween Gambit after e4, e5, knight f3, and knight g6, it's important to know how to respond. In this gambit, white sacrifices a knight to attack with d4. Usually, we've talked about what happens when black's knight moves to c6. Now, let's see what to do if it goes to g6. We start by playing e5 to put pressure on the knight. It can't move to certain squares because of our knight and queen, so his only choice is to move his knight back. At this point, I would like to suggest to develop with bishop c4, but I prefer playing queen to f3 because it can catch your opponent off guard. Usually, black responds with d6, then, you can bring out your bishop and put pressure on f7. If black tries defending with the queen, you can continue developing your pieces and building pressure. However, sometimes black plays bishop e6, offering a trade, but there's a clever tactic here. First, capture this pawn. If he takes your bishop, don't worry, use the sneaky queen check. Eventually, you'll win the bishop back. Plus, if he gets greedy and grabs these pawns, you have queen e4, pinning the knight and putting black in trouble. Even if he defends, you can play f4, ultimately winning the knight. After playing queen f3, d6 is the most common response. As we've seen, another move black often plays is developing the bishop and pinning your knight. In this situation, play bishop c4 as usual, targeting f7. Most people respond with queen e7. Now, simply castle, if he exchanges the bishop for your knight. Observe the pawn structure. Our pieces are primed to enter the action. We dominate the central squares, making it tough for black. Look at these pieces, they don't seem very effective for the next few moves. After reviewing all these variations, it's clear that the key question is how to respond to this intimidating opening as black. When white plays d4, the knight has 2 retreat options. However, I strongly suggest going back to g6 instead of c6 because moving to c6 gives white exactly what they want. Count the number of moves white gains: 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 moves in a row for white on the black knights, leading to a strong center for white. So, avoid this path and choose g6 instead. This way, only one knight becomes a target for white. It's a bit unfortunate that we have to retreat once, but it's not a major issue. Let's say white plays queen f3. Now, this is the moment where you need to push back and prevent white from taking control. Here's a simple tip that can help you counter many tricky opening sacrifices. When you have a significant material advantage and your opponent gains a lot of activity, the best strategy is to give back some material to reduce their advantage. I understand you want to keep the extra knight, but you'll need to sacrifice something in return to balance the game. So now is the time to make a sacrifice, which is why I recommend playing the move d5. Let your opponent take this pawn. Capturing en passant isn't ideal for white because it allows you to develop your bishops, which is not what they want. After d5, they'll likely capture with the queen. You can then opt for an exchange, giving yourself some breathing room. Since knight c7 is the main threat, you'll move your king accordingly, and the game continues. Despite white having those 2 central pawns causing annoyance, you still have extra material, and let me share a quote with you. Your passions matter, let them speak louder than your doubts. So, I'd say the game is fairly balanced now, and it's all about playing strategically from this point onward. In this scenario, if your opponent brings out the bishop instead of the queen, you'll still execute the move d5. This forces white to waste a move by capturing the pawn, allowing you to gain tempo by attacking the bishop. When the bishop retreats, you can continue developing your pieces and neutralize white's attack on f7. Additionally, you take control of the d5 square, setting up for a strong position later. Overall, this strategy makes it easier for black to play against the Halloween Gambit, as you can still castle safely and there are no immediate threats to worry about. Let's solve a puzzle. It's white's turn in this position, and I want you to figure out the best move for white. Share your answers in the comments below. I'm excited to see how many of you can solve it correctly. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more chess content. See you in the next video. Bye bye, see ya.